My hands trembled as I held my phone, reading and rereading the message that would change everything. Immediate termination. The biting Melbourne wind whistled outside the window, but the cold I felt came from within. My mind was spinning. I had just received a medical leave, something I didn't ask for on a whim, but out of real necessity. My body was screaming for rest, but my boss, David, simply ignored it. He thought he could crush me, wipe me out as if I were insignificant. But he made a serious mistake, a mistake that would cost him dearly. As I stared at that message, my rapid breathing fogging up the screen of my phone, I realized that this wasn't just about me. It was about justice, about showing that no one can walk all over others without facing the consequences. It was there, in that moment of despair, that I decided I was going to fight. And this fight would be epic. If you want to know how I turned a personal injustice into a monumental victory, sign up now. I'll show you how I turned the tables on a powerful man, made millions, and changed lives, including my own. This is a story of courage, twists and turns, and overcoming adversity that you won't want to miss. My name is Laura Bennett, and until a few weeks ago, I was just another employee trying to survive in a relentless corporate world. I'm 35 years old, with brown hair that I barely comb on busy days, and eyes that always look tired. Because, well, they are. I worked for almost a decade at the same company, slowly climbing the ladder, trying to prove my worth. I'm the type of person who is overly dedicated, who believes that hard work and honesty are rewarded. Or at least that's what I thought. David, my former boss, is a tall, imposing man with a crisply ironed suit and a fake smile that he uses as a weapon. He has this air of superiority that makes you feel small, just for being in the same room with him. David is the typical greedy businessman who sees people as numbers and profits as his top priority. He doesn't care about the consequences, as long as he gets what he wants. And it was that mentality that got me into the situation. Then there's Sarah, my lawyer. She came into my life when I was already losing hope. Sarah is different from me. She's direct, confident, and not afraid to confront anyone. Her blue eyes seem to see right through people, and her firm posture conveys confidence. She has a thin scar on the corner of her mouth, the result of an old fight, as she told me herself. "I learned to fight early on," she once said. And that pretty much sums her up. Sarah not only believed in my cause, she saw something bigger in it, an opportunity to expose the flaws of a rotten system. These three characters, me, David, and Sarah, form the pillars of this story. Each of us is motivated by something different. I seek justice, not just for myself, but for all the people who have been ignored or trampled on by bosses like David. He, on the other hand, only cares about protecting his reputation and fortune, even if it means destroying lives. And Sarah? She wants to prove that the law can be a powerful tool for changing the game. Together, we've created a narrative full of tension, twists, and moments that will leave you breathless. These characters aren't just names on a page. They have blood, tears, and dreams. They have stories that intersect in ways none of us could have predicted. This is a journey about how choices, weaknesses, and courage can transform lives. Want to know how these pieces fit together? Stay with me, and you'll see how each of them plays their part in this drama that goes far beyond a simple case of unfair dismissal. The office where it all happened was a place that mixed the smell of stale coffee with something harder to describe. Perhaps it was the weight of accumulated stress, hanging in the air like an invisible fog. The walls were covered with beige wallpaper that was peeling in some corners, and the brown carpet was worn, almost ragged near the swivel chairs. I always felt that rough texture under my shoes when I walked to the printer, as if the floor itself was trying to hold me there against my will. The fluorescent light flickered above my desk, buzzing annoyingly, as if it were about to go out at any moment. On colder days, Like the one when I received the devastating news. The heater made a constant metallic noise, but the heat never reached the corners of the room. The cold Melbourne wind blew through the cracks in the poorly sealed window, cutting across my back as I tried to concentrate. I remember crossing my arms to protect myself, but even that didn't help much. Outside, the gray sky reflected my state of mind. Heavy clouds hung over the city, and light rain tapped against the window, leaving irregular trails that looked like tears streaming down. The distant sound of cars on the street mingled with the echo of footsteps in the hallway, each step echoing as a reminder that I was not alone in this battle, but also that no one really saw me. When David called me into his office, I noticed the excessive shine of the varnish on his expensive wooden desk, contrasting with the general wear and tear of the room. He adjusted his red tie as he spoke, without looking directly at me. His voice was firm, almost robotic, but I could feel the weight of his words hitting my chest like stones. The tension was palpable, and the silence that followed his decision was deafening. It was like being submerged in an ocean of uncertainty, unable to breathe. This place, which had once been just an ordinary office, now felt like a prison. Every sensory detail, the smells, the sounds, the sensations, was marked by the memory of the day my life changed forever. And yet I knew that this oppressive atmosphere was only the beginning of something much bigger. It all started with a simple doctor's note. It seemed so mundane, so routine, that I didn't even hesitate to hand it to David that cold morning. 30 days of medical leave, the document read. The doctor had been clear. You need rest. Your body is crying out for help. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. It wasn't a selfish request. It was a real need. But David didn't see it that way. When I walked into his office, he was leaning over his desk, typing something on his laptop with that irritating intensity he always showed when he wanted to look too busy to be bothered. I cleared my throat, and he looked up, flashing that fake smile I knew so well. Yes, Laura? He barely looked at me as I handed him the paper. He took it without much attention, quickly scanning the contents. Then something changed in his face. He furrowed his brow and let out a short, almost sarcastic laugh. Mandatory rest? Seriously? He shook his head as if it were all a joke. You're not sick enough for that. I felt the blood rush to my face. Sir, the doctor was explicit. I need this time to avoid further complications. My voice trembled, but I tried to remain firm. He leaned back in his swivel chair, crossing his arms. Complications? Do you have any idea how many people here have health problems and continue to work? This isn't a clinic, Laura. It's a company. His voice sounded like a sharp knife, cutting through my every word. The next day, I received my resignation letter. It was simple, cold, and direct. For just cause, the official text. Read. My heart sank. How could he do this? I had dedicated years to that company, sacrificing nights, weekends, and even time with my family. And now, when I really needed support, he was discarding me as if I were expendable. That injustice consumed me. I spent hours sitting on the edge of my bed, clutching the envelope as if it would explode at any moment. The weight of the situation crushed me. It was more than losing a job. It was losing my dignity, my voice. Or so it seemed. But then something inside me changed. That bubbling anger began to take shape. I knew he had made a serious mistake, perhaps bigger than he realized. That's when I decided to reach out to Sarah. I called her late at night, hesitant, but determined. She listened quietly before saying, Laura, this is much more than an unfair dismissal. This could be the beginning of something much bigger. Her words sparked something in me. Maybe this was my chance to fight not only for myself, but for all the other people David had stepped on over the years. The initial conflict was clear. Me against David. A tired, exhausted, and discarded woman against a powerful and arrogant man. But deep down, I knew this battle would be much more than personal. It was about justice, about showing that no one is above the consequences of their actions. And although I didn't yet know what the future held, one thing was certain. I wasn't going to give up without a fight. This was just the beginning. As soon as I decided to sue David, I realized that the fight would be much bigger than I had imagined. Hiring Sarah was the first step, but I soon discovered that good lawyers don't work for free, and my bank account was already in the red. Every penny I had saved over the years went straight to her initial fees. "This is just the beginning," Sarah warned, with that practical tone she always used when she wanted to prepare me for the worst. "We need more evidence, Laura. Internal documents, witnesses. Anything that can prove this wasn't an isolated incident." That's when I started calling former employees of the company. I knew I wasn't the only one who had been treated like trash by David, but convincing these women to speak up wasn't easy. Many of them were afraid of retaliation, of being exposed, or simply of reliving that pain. I remember one conversation in particular with a woman named Rachel. She worked in accounting and was fired 2 years ago after requesting maternity leave. When I called her, her voice was shaking. "I can't, Laura. He still has power over me. What if he finds out I talked to you?" I hung up the phone with a tightness in my chest. It was frustrating to see how David was able to intimidate people even after so much time had passed. The nights became long and endless. I stayed up late, surfing the internet, looking for something, anything that could help. Sometimes I found myself staring at the ceiling, thinking about giving up. Was it worth it? Maybe it would be better to move on, accept defeat, and try to start over somewhere else. But every time that thought crossed my mind, I remembered David's smug smile, the way he dismissed me as if I were invisible. No, he wasn't going to get away with this. One night, while searching through old emails for something useful, I came across an exchange between me and a coworker named Mia. She had once mentioned that David pressured sick employees to return to work early, even when doctors recommended otherwise. I sent her a message, hesitantly. To my surprise, she replied quickly, "Laura, I've been through this too. I'm willing to help." Those words were like a ray of light in the darkness. But it wasn't all small victories. The next day, I received another call, this time from a former colleague named Sophie. She had agreed to testify, but changed her mind. "I'm sorry, Laura. He offered me money to keep quiet. I can't risk it." The disappointment was like a punch in the stomach. Once again, David was showing his power, buying silence and manipulating people to protect his reputation. I knew I needed more than just testimonials. So Sarah suggested that I start documenting everything. Every email, every message, every detail that could be used against him. I spent days organizing files, separating documents that proved irregularities within the company. There were strange financial reports, meeting minutes where unethical decisions were openly discussed, and even internal messages that made it clear that David systematically ignored labor laws. But the more I dug, the more dangerous it all seemed. One night, when I got home, I noticed something strange. My car was parked in the same spot where I had left it, but something was different. When I got closer, I saw that the tires had been slashed. My heart raced. Who would do this? I looked around, but the streets were deserted. That's when I noticed something written on the rear window in black paint. "Give up." My hands began to shake as I wiped the glass with the sleeve of my shirt. The message was clear. They knew what I was doing, and they were willing to scare me. That was the first real crisis. It was no longer just a legal dispute. It was personal. David was crossing dangerous lines, and I had to decide how far I was willing to go. As scary as it was, something inside me refused to give in. I knew that if I gave up now, I would be allowing him to continue doing this to other people. And that was something I couldn't accept. This initial battle was like a game of chess, where every move required strategy and courage. I was learning fast that fighting someone like David wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. After weeks of fighting, we finally scored a small victory. 3 women, Mia, Claire, and Jennifer, agreed to testify against David. It was more than I had hoped for at first, and it gave me momentary relief, as if the weight on my shoulders had lifted for the first time in months. When Sarah and I got together to discuss strategy, she smiled for the first time since we started this battle. "This is good, Laura. Very good," she said, tapping the table with restrained enthusiasm. "These stories will strengthen our case. He won't know what hit him." That feeling of progress was incredible. I started sleeping better at night, without waking up in a cold sweat, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. I even found myself imagining what it would be like when it was all over. Getting back to a normal life, maybe even starting something new. I allowed myself to dream for a few moments. Claire called me one afternoon to say she was feeling stronger, more confident about being part of this. "We're finally taking him on," she said, and I could hear the pride in her voice. It felt like we were building something bigger than just a legal case. We were creating a support network, a collective force against injustice. But then came the blow. One day, while checking my inbox, I found a short, blunt message from Jennifer. "I'm sorry, Laura. I can't do this anymore." My hands froze on the keyboard. I tried to call her right away, but her phone was off. The next day, I learned why. David had offered generous financial compensation to any current or former employee who would drop the case. It was enough money to change lives, and Jennifer couldn't resist. She sent me a message later explaining her decision. "I need to think about my family," she wrote. "I hope you understand." The disappointment was overwhelming. The false sense of security that had enveloped me over the past few days collapsed like a house of cards. I stood in the kitchen, clutching my phone, trying to process what had happened. Sarah noticed my silence when we met in her office. "What's wrong?" she asked, concerned. I told her about Jennifer, and she sighed deeply. "It's his game. Laura, he's trying to destabilize us. He can't buy us all, but he'll try until the end." Even so, doubt began to creep into my mind. What if other people gave up too? What if we were left alone in this fight? I began to question my own choices. Maybe we were fighting a losing battle. Fear returned to my thoughts, and that temporary tranquility evaporated like smoke in the wind. But even with these uncertainties, something inside me still resisted. I knew that giving up would mean allowing David to continue doing this to other people. We still had Mia and Claire, and they were standing strong. I decided we couldn't let ourselves be shaken. "Let's keep going," I told Sarah during our next meeting. "If he wants to play dirty, we'll play harder." That brief sense of security had been illusory, but it served a purpose. It showed me that we could move forward, even when things seemed to be falling apart. Now we needed to be stronger than ever. After Jennifer gave up, the mood changed. The tension weighed heavily on us again, like a dark cloud about to burst. I knew David was just getting started with his dirty tricks, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. One morning, as I was leaving the house to meet Sarah at her office, I noticed something strange about my car. I stopped a few feet away, my heart already racing. The tires had been slashed, and there was a message written in black spray paint on the rear window. "Give up." My whole body froze. I stood there frozen for a moment, staring at those words as if they could come to life and attack me. Who would do this? It was obvious that someone was trying to intimidate me, and I didn't have to be a genius to guess who was behind it. David was sending a clear message. He knew what I was doing, and he wasn't going to stop until he made me back down. I immediately called Sarah, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. "This is serious, Laura. she said, her voice firm but with a tone of urgency I had never heard before. "We can't ignore this. He's crossing dangerous lines now." She suggested, "I file a police report and ask for protection," but I hesitated. What if it made things worse? What if David found out I was afraid and used it against me? Still, I did as she told me. On the way to the police station, I felt the eyes of strangers on me, as if every person on the street could be watching my movements. For the first time, I felt unsafe even in my own city. When I filed the report, the police officer asked me directly, "Are you sure you want to go through with this? This could get very dangerous." His words echoed inside me. It was exactly what David wanted, to scare me into giving up. But I knew that if I backed down now, I would be giving him exactly what he wanted. The following days were even more tense. I received anonymous calls in the middle of the night, always with the same whispered message: "You won't win." I hung up every time, but each call left invisible marks on my mind. I could barely sleep, and when I finally did, I was haunted by nightmares. David laughing, people surrounding me, cars being vandalized. I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that someone was outside my window. Sarah noticed that I was shaken. "He's trying to break you down psychologically," she said during one of our meetings. "But you can't let it work. That's his strategy. To make you doubt yourself. To make you think you're alone." She was right, but it was hard to stay calm when everything seemed to be conspiring against me. To make matters worse, Mia began to show signs of hesitation. She called me one night, her voice low and nervous. "Laura, I'm scared. What if he does something to me too? What if I lose my job?" I tried to reassure her, telling her we were doing the right thing, but I could feel her confidence wavering. Then, another bombshell dropped. Claire received an official letter from David's company, threatening to sue her for defamation if she continued to be involved in the case. "They're bluffing," Sarah assured her, but the emotional damage was already done. Claire panicked. "I can't risk it, Laura. I'm sorry." Another piece of our puzzle was falling into place, and I found myself questioning again whether this fight was worth so much sacrifice. But deep down, I knew it was. Every obstacle thrown in my path only proved that we were onto something bigger. David wouldn't be acting this way if he didn't have something to hide. And that's when I realized he was afraid. Afraid of being exposed, of losing everything he had built at the expense of others. That thought kept me going, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Sarah and I decided to intensify our search for evidence. We spent nights poring over old documents, looking for anything that could give us a decisive advantage. It was exhausting, but each new discovery reminded me why I couldn't give up. This second crisis wasn't just a test of courage. It was a battle for the truth, and I was determined to win it. David thought he could intimidate me, but he underestimated one thing: my determination. If he wanted war, I was ready to fight. Everything seemed to be piling up around me, and the pressure was almost unbearable. Sarah and I had found something big. While reviewing internal documents from David's company, we discovered a series of emails exchanged between him and his accountants that exposed serious financial irregularities. These weren't just minor administrative errors. It was a large-scale tax evasion scheme. These documents could ruin David completely, not just in labor court, but also criminally. But there was a problem. The documents were confidential, obtained through questionable sources. Sarah explained that if we leaked this evidence, it would be admissible in court, but I would be violating corporate privacy laws. "This is a dangerous line to cross," she said, her expression serious as she handed me the printed sheets. "If we get caught, it could cost us dearly." I knew she was right. It was a moral dilemma I hadn't expected to face. On the one hand, this could be the final blow against David, exposing not only his unethical practices with employees, but also much more serious crimes. On the other hand, if we were discovered using this information, I would be putting everything on the line. My credibility, the case, and even my freedom. I asked myself, was it worth the risk? I spent days thinking about it, unable to make a decision. Every time I looked at those papers, I felt a mixture of anger and fear. Anger because David had done terrible things and deserved to be exposed. Fear because if this went wrong, I would be destroyed along with him. I remembered Mia's words when she said she wanted justice, but also feared the consequences. She was right. This fight wasn't just about winning. It was about deciding who I wanted to be in the process. One night, as I walked alone through the quiet streets of Melbourne, I decided to call Sarah. "What if we don't have a choice?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if this is the only way to make sure he pays for what he did?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she replied. "Then we need to make sure we're prepared for the consequences." I decided to go ahead. It wasn't easy. I spent hours awake, questioning every detail. Was I being ethical? Was I acting out of justice or revenge? In the end, I concluded that it wasn't about me. It was about all the people David had hurt, all the lives he had destroyed out of greed. If exposing these documents meant protecting others from going through what I had gone through, then I would do it. Sarah helped me devise a strategy to release the documents anonymously. We used secure channels to send them to the press and the prosecutor handling our case. When I finally hit the send button, I felt a chill down my spine. It was like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was anything to catch me. In the days that followed, the media exploded with the revelations. Reports appeared in every newspaper, and David's name was everywhere. He tried to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. The court ordered a full investigation, and the case expanded beyond my initial claim for damages. Now it was something much bigger. But that decision weighed heavily on me. Every night, I wondered if I had done the right thing. There were moments when I felt like a hero, fighting against a corrupt system. At other times, I wondered if I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Still, I knew there was no turning back. I chose this path because I believed it was necessary. And now, all I could do was wait and see where it would take me. This third crisis changed everything. Not only did it raise the stakes, but it also tested who I was and what I was willing to sacrifice in the name of justice. With the documents leaked, the situation exploded in a way that neither Sarah nor I could have predicted. The media was in a frenzy, and David's name was everywhere. Newspapers, news broadcasts, social media. He tried to deny the accusations, but every public statement seemed to only worsen his position. The court ordered a full investigation into the company's financial practices, and that turned our case of wrongful termination into something much bigger, a corporate scandal of epic proportions. But for me, this explosion of attention came at a high price. The threats increased exponentially. I received anonymous messages constantly, some so explicit that I began to fear for my physical safety. One day when I got home, I found my apartment ransacked. Drawers were open, papers were scattered on the floor, furniture had been moved. Nothing of value was missing. It was clear that this was no ordinary burglary. It was a message. "They're telling you to stop," Sarah said when I called her, still shaking as I looked at the mess. But now it's too late to back down. The pressure increased every day. I could barely sleep or eat, and even leaving the house became a frightening task. Every unusual sound made me look over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. I started avoiding predictable routines, changing my route to work, and avoiding places where I was often seen. It was like living under a constant cloud of paranoia, and I knew David was behind it all. He was trying to break me before the trial was over. In the midst of this unbearable tension, another bomb went off. Mia received a visit from a man who identified himself as a legal representative of the company. He handed her a formal letter demanding that she withdraw her testimony, threatening to sue her for financial losses caused by the leak of the documents. "They're going to ruin me," she cried on the phone when she called me. "I can't handle this, Laura." I tried to reassure her, but I could feel her voice weakening. Once again, I saw a crucial piece of our case slipping through my fingers. Sarah insisted that we needed to act fast. "If we lose any more witnesses, they can use that against us in court," she said during an emergency meeting at her office. "We need to make sure all the evidence is airtight." We decided to ramp up our efforts, working 18-hour days to consolidate everything we had gathered so far. But no matter how hard we tried to prepare, time was running out. The final blow came when we discovered that David had hired a team of renowned lawyers who specialized in demolishing cases like ours. They began attacking our credibility, questioning the origin of the evidence, and trying to invalidate the leaked documents. In court, their strategies were relentless. Witnesses were intimidated, facts were distorted, and every little flaw in our argument was amplified. It was like watching a chess game, where their every move seemed to corner us further. "We're losing ground," I admitted to Sarah one night after another devastating day in court. She sighed, tired, but still determined. "We have to find something new, something he's not expecting, something that will completely change the game." Those words echoed in my mind. I knew she was right, but where could we find it? We were exhausted, out of resources, and the clock was ticking. That's when I remembered something I had set aside. Old records of internal meetings that I had saved years ago when I was still working for David. Among them were audio recordings, informal conversations between him and his executives discussing unethical practices. At the time, I kept these files as a precaution, not knowing that one day they might come in handy. Now, they were our last resort. I decided to hand over the audio files to the court, even though I knew they could be considered illegal evidence depending on how they were interpreted. But there was no other choice. We were on the brink, and every second counted. When I pressed the send button to share the files with the judge, I felt a mixture of relief and terror. It was a huge risk, but also our only chance to turn the tables. That fourth crisis was the most intense of all. The urgency was palpable, and every decision seemed like a matter of life and death. We knew we were walking a tightrope, but there was no other way. The next step would be the decisive confrontation, and I knew that everything would be at stake. The courtroom was packed that morning, a crowd of onlookers and journalists, eager to follow the outcome of the case that had taken on national proportions. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as a heavy fog that seemed to suffocate every breath. Sarah and I arrived early, but even so we were surrounded by camera flashes and questions shouted by reporters eager for a statement. She guided me by the arm, firm, whispering, "Keep your head up, Laura. Today is the day." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The judge, a gray-haired man with piercing eyes, watched everything with an impassive expression. David sat at the opposite table, his expensive suit impeccable, but his eyes revealed something I had never seen before: fear. He tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but his hands trembled as he leafed through papers. His team of lawyers whispered strategies in low voices, but it was clear they were nervous. We knew that the audio recordings we had submitted would be played that day, and that would change everything. Sarah and I had prepared for hours for this moment, reviewing every detail of our argument. But no matter how prepared I was, nothing could have prepared me for the feeling of being there, in front of everyone, knowing that not only the fate of my case, but also David's reputation, would be decided in the next few hours. As we waited for the session to begin, Sarah squeezed my hand discreetly. "Everything will be fine," she said. But I knew that was more of an attempt to calm me down than a statement of absolute certainty. The hearing began with the usual formalities, but the atmosphere quickly became tense. David's lawyers started with a brutal attack, questioning the validity of the evidence presented so far. They argued that the leaked documents were illegal and that the audio recordings were invalid because they had been obtained without consent. For a moment, I felt my heart sink. What if they managed to invalidate everything? What if all our efforts had been in vain? But Sarah was ready. With her clear, firm voice, she refuted every point raised by the defense. "This evidence was not collected on a whim," she said, looking directly at the judge. "It exposes a systematic pattern of abuse and corruption that deserves to be investigated. To ignore it would be to neglect justice." The room fell silent as the judge pondered her words. Then came the decisive moment. The audio recordings would be played. Sarah asked the judge for permission to play the recordings, and he agreed, after a brief deliberation. When the first recording began to play over the speakers, the impact was immediate. It was David's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing plans to manipulate financial reports and avoid labor inspections. Each word was an implicit confession, a direct blow to his carefully constructed defense. I watched his face as he listened, seeing the exact moment when he realized he was trapped. His eyes widened, and he began to sweat visibly. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the recordings continued. David's lawyers tried to interrupt, claiming that this was illegal and prejudicial, but the judge silenced them with a firm gesture. "This will be considered part of the evidence," he declared, his voice echoing around the room. It was a crucial moment, a turning point. I could feel the tide turning in our favor. But the tension didn't ease. David's team launched a last-ditch attack, calling surprise witnesses to try to contradict our allegations. One of them was a former employee who claimed that the company's practices were normal and that no one had been forced to do anything. It was a bold move, but Sarah was prepared. With incisive questions, she dismantled the testimony, exposing contradictions and weaknesses. When the witness left the stand, it was clear that his credibility had been compromised. While all this was happening, I struggled to maintain my composure. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. Every minute seemed to last an eternity, and I could barely breathe. I knew we were close to the end, but there were still many variables at play. The judge could decide anything, and every second that passed increased the pressure on us. At the end of the session, the judge announced that he would render his decision the following day. As we left the courtroom, I was approached by reporters again, but this time, I felt something different. It was no longer just fear or uncertainty. It was a sense that we were on the verge of achieving something monumental. Sarah put her hand on my shoulder as we walked. "You've made it this far, Laura," she said. "Now we just have to hold on a little longer." She was right. We were on the verge of the final showdown, and I knew that everything would be decided soon. The next day would bring the verdict, and I was determined to face whatever came my way. The day of the verdict arrived, and I could barely sleep the night before. I stayed up late, reviewing every detail of the case that had consumed months of my life. Every document, every testimony, every difficult decision echoed in my mind, like an endless movie. Sarah had told me to rest, but how could I? Tomorrow would be the decisive moment, the finish line of a race that had seemed impossible when it all began. When I entered the courtroom that morning, I felt a different energy in the air. It was as if everyone there, judges, lawyers, journalists, spectators, knew we were about to witness something historic. The room was packed, and the buzz of conversation was interrupted only by the sound of heavy doors closing behind us. David was there, sitting with his lawyers, but his usual arrogant demeanor was gone. He looked smaller, more fragile, as if he were finally realizing that his castle of lies was about to come crashing down. Sarah and I took our places at our table, and she gave me a steady look before starting to organize our papers for the 1,000th time. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. I nodded, even though my stomach was in knots. I knew there was nothing more we could do, but wait. Now, it was in the judge's hands. The judge entered the room, and the silence was absolute. He adjusted his glasses as he leafed through the final documents, his expression impassive. For a moment, I had the feeling that he was deliberately prolonging the unbearable suspense. Finally, he cleared his throat and began to speak. After considering all the evidence presented in this case, including internal documents, audio recordings, and witness testimony, this court has concluded that there is substantial evidence of both labor and financial misconduct on the part of the company represented by the defendant. My heart stopped. Those words were everything I had hoped to hear, but even so, they seemed surreal. Sarah squeezed my hand discreetly but remained focused on the judge. He continued, explaining that David's practices had violated several labor and tax laws, making it clear that the consequences would be severe. Furthermore, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, the recordings provided by the plaintiff corroborate these findings and will be considered valid for the purposes of this proceeding. David's lawyers tried to protest, but their voices sounded weak, almost pathetic. The judge cut them off with a firm gesture. This court recognizes that, while the means of obtaining the evidence may be questionable, the seriousness of the crimes revealed justifies its admission. It was a hard blow to the defense, and I could see the exact moment when David realized he had lost. His face went pale, and he lowered his eyes, defeated. Then came the moment I had both dreaded and hoped for, the final verdict. The judge ruled that I should receive substantial compensation for the moral and material damages caused by the unfair dismissal. But that wasn't all. He ordered a full investigation into David's company's financial practices, ordering all assets to be frozen until the case was resolved. The murmurs in the room exploded into a sea of reactions. Some applauded, others whispered shocked comments. David tried to get up to leave, but was stopped by officers who entered the room to formally notify him of the criminal investigation. He protested, his voice shaky and high-pitched, but no one paid any attention. He was escorted out of the courtroom, and for the first time since this all began, I felt a sense of complete relief. It wasn't just about me. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring that he paid for his actions. Sarah turned to me with a triumphant smile. "You did it, Laura. Against all odds, you won." Her words brought me back to reality. I looked around, seeing reporters rushing to publish their stories and other victims of David hugging each other in tears. It was as if the weight of years of injustice had finally been lifted. But I knew that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a clear message. No one is above the law, no matter how powerful they are. As I left the courthouse surrounded by flashbulbs and applause, I felt something I never imagined I would feel. Peace. I had faced my greatest fears, fought a man who tried to destroy me, and emerged victorious. This decisive confrontation was not just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new phase in my life. As I walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and camera flashes, I felt like I had finally reached the end of a long journey. Victory was sweet, but something still felt incomplete. David had been exposed, his company was in ruins, and I had received the compensation I deserved. But the case would not end there, or at least not in the way I expected. The next day, Sarah called me with an urgency I hadn't heard since the beginning of the case. "Laura, you need to come to the office right now," she said, her voice tense. "There's something we need to discuss." My mind started racing. What else could happen? I had already won, right? When I arrived at Sarah's office, she was sitting at her desk with a stack of documents spread out in front of her. Her expression was serious, almost worried. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. She took a deep breath before answering. The investigators found something new during the financial audit of David's company. Something much bigger than we imagined. She handed me a detailed report, and I began to leaf through it. My heart stopped when I understood what I was reading. It wasn't just tax evasion. David was involved in an international money laundering scheme connected to criminal operations in several countries. The evidence was irrefutable. Bank transactions, offshore accounts, and even encrypted messages detailing how he moved millions in illegal deals. It was a scandal of global proportions, and my case had been the tip of the iceberg. "This changes everything," Sarah said, looking me straight in the eye. "You're no longer just a wronged employee. You've triggered an investigation that could lead to the arrest of some very powerful people. And that means you're in real danger." A chill ran down my spine. Until then, I had thought the worst was over. But now I realized I had opened a door that might not be so easy to close. Sarah recommended that I enter a temporary protection program while the authorities dealt with the fallout from the case. "They'll want to talk to you," she explained, "but they'll also ensure your safety." Over the next few days, I was taken to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. It was strange to be isolated from the world after months of fighting so hard. But as I processed everything that had happened, I began to understand the full impact of what we had done. David's case wasn't just about me. It was part of a corrupt network that affected thousands of people around the world. Then came the final twist. During a press conference, federal prosecutors announced that my courage in speaking out against David had been crucial in dismantling an international criminal organization. They mentioned my name publicly, highlighting my determination to take on someone so powerful. More than that, they revealed that I would be financially compensated for exposing the scheme, a sum far greater than anything I could have imagined. It was surreal. From a tired, exhausted woman fighting an unfair dismissal, I became part of something much bigger. I gained millions, yes. But more importantly, I gained the certainty that I had done the right thing. David wasn't just a greedy boss. He was a criminal who used his power to destroy lives. And in the end, he paid for it. If you want to know how I turned a small personal battle into a monumental victory, sign up now. I'll show you how I faced my fears, overcame adversity, and achieved justice, and how it changed my life forever. This is a story of courage that will inspire you to never give up, no matter how difficult it seems. Sitting in that safe house, far away from everything I knew, I had time to reflect on the whirlwind that had been my life in recent months. I was no longer the same woman who walked into David's office with a doctor's letter in her hands, trembling with fear and uncertainty. That Laura was lost somewhere in the past, replaced by someone stronger, more resilient. But this transformation was not easy. It required me to face my own fears, doubts, and weaknesses. At the beginning of this journey, I saw myself as a victim. It was painful to accept that David had treated me as if I were disposable, as if my effort and dedication were worthless. I wanted justice, yes, but I also wanted to prove something to myself, that I wasn't invisible, that my voice mattered. However, as the battle progressed, I realized that this went far beyond me. It was about all the people who had been ignored, intimidated, or destroyed by corrupt systems. And by putting myself in this position of struggle, I also had to confront my own weaknesses. There were times when I almost gave up. When my car tires were slashed, when I received anonymous threats, when witnesses began to back down. All of this made me question whether I had the strength to continue. There were days when I woke up exhausted, thinking, is it worth it? But deep down, I knew it was. I knew that giving up would mean allowing David to continue doing this to other people. And even when I doubted myself, I kept fighting. That decision, that conscious choice to keep going despite my fear, is what really changed me. The final twist, finding out that David was involved in international crimes, was a shock, but it also brought clarity. This was no longer just about me or him. It was about exposing something bigger, something that affected thousands of people. And as I processed all of this, I realized that my initial fight against a personal injustice had turned into something much more meaningful. I wasn't just a woman seeking redress. I was part of a movement for transparency and justice. That internal growth is what has impacted me the most. At first, I was fighting for revenge. I wanted David to suffer for the things he did to me. But along the way, I realized that the real victory wasn't punishing him. It was freeing myself from the weight he had placed on me. The anger I had felt for so long began to give way to something different. Peace. Not because he was arrested or lost everything, but because I finally understood that his power over me was over. Sarah once told me, "You can't control what others do, but you can control how you react." At the time, those words seemed too simple to capture the complexity of what I was facing. But now, they made perfect sense. I couldn't control David's actions, or the threats I received, or the difficulties that arose along the way. But I could choose how to respond to each obstacle, and that choice was what kept me going until the end. When I finally left the safe house and returned to my normal life, I realized that the real victory wasn't the money or the public exposure. It was knowing that I had faced my greatest fears and come out stronger on the other side. I learned to trust myself, to not let other people's opinions shake me, and to fight for what I believe in, even when everyone says it's impossible. This journey has taught me that we are stronger than we think, that even when everything seems to be against us, there's always a way to move forward. Today, I look back and see a woman who not only survived, but grew. A woman who found her voice and used it to make a difference. That is the legacy I want to leave. Not just for myself, but for all the people who are still fighting their own Davids. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's becoming someone they never could have imagined you would be. The day I left the safe house, I felt like I was stepping into a new world. The case against David had been officially closed, and the repercussions were greater than anyone could have predicted. Not only did he lose his company and his reputation, he was arrested and charged with crimes ranging from money laundering to international racketeering. The headlines screamed his name, but I no longer felt hatred when I read them. To me, he was just a shadow of the arrogant man who had tried to crush me. The final court ruling left no room for doubt. I had won. I received compensation for moral and material damages, as well as additional compensation for the crucial evidence I provided during the federal investigation. But what really marked the immediate resolution of the main conflict was the feeling that this battle, which had started out as something so personal and painful, had exposed something much bigger. I was no longer just Laura Bennett, the wronged former employee. I was a key player in the downfall of a criminal empire. At the same time, there were moments of emotional adjustment. When I returned to my apartment, I could still feel the echoes of those tense months. The image of my car with slashed tires, the anonymous threats, and the sleepless nights would remain etched in my memory for a long time. But oddly enough, those memories no longer haunted me as much. They now represented something different. Courage. Every obstacle I faced was a step toward victory, and that gave me strength. Sarah called the day after I returned. "Are you okay?" Her concern was genuine, but it also carried a tone of pride. "You made history, Laura. Few people have the courage to do what you did." We talked for hours, going over everything that had happened and planning the next steps. I decided to use part of the settlement money to create a foundation to help workers who are victims of corporate abuse. It was a way to turn my pain into something positive, to ensure that other people didn't have to go through what I went through alone. I also had to deal with the public impact of the case. Reporters kept coming after me, wanting interviews and details about my life. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to expose myself too much or be seen as a public figure. But then, I realized that my story could inspire others to fight for their rights. I accepted a few invitations to speak at events and on TV shows, always emphasizing that justice is possible when we don't give up. David, on the other hand, was completely ruined. I read in one of the newspapers that he had lost everything. His fortune, his contacts, even his family, who distanced themselves from him after the accusations. A photo showed him being led away in handcuffs to a federal prison, his face down, defeated. I remembered the first time I walked into his office and he laughed at my medical leave. At that moment, he seemed invincible. Now, he was just a man paying for his own choices. But here's the truth. The victory wasn't about destroying David. It was about restoring my dignity, my confidence, and my voice. For years, I thought my worth was tied to my job, to the approval of others, or to the idea that I needed to constantly prove myself. This process taught me that my value comes from within, and that no one can take it away from me without my consent. With the settlement money, I moved to a small house by the sea on the Gold Coast. It was a peaceful place where I could breathe and reflect. I started walking on the beach every morning, watching the sun rise and thinking about how much had changed. I left behind the tired, insecure woman I once was. Now, I was someone who knew the weight of her choices and the power of her resilience. I still get messages from people who followed the case. Some want advice, others just want to thank me for giving voice to their own struggles. I respond to everyone sincerely, because I know exactly how it feels to be invisible. Today, my life is much more than a battle against a greedy boss. It's about moving forward, finding peace, and using my experiences to make a difference. That was the immediate resolution of the main conflict. The certainty that despite everything, I had won. Not just in court, but within myself. The consequences of this epic battle spread like ripples on a lake, touching the lives of everyone, involved in ways I could never have predicted. David, my arrogant and ruthless former boss, was reduced to nothing more than a name in the newspapers, a symbol of greed and corruption. He spent months in prison awaiting trial for crimes far more serious than the unfair dismissal he imposed on me. When he was finally convicted, his sentence included years behind bars and astronomical fines that ensured he would never again enjoy the luxurious lifestyle he once had. His wife filed for divorce, and his children cut off contact. The last. I heard he was working in a factory trying to rebuild his life, but he was no longer the powerful man I once knew. He was just a shadow of his former self. Sarah, my tireless lawyer, had her career transformed by the case. She became known nationally as an expert in labor rights and fighting corporate corruption. She received numerous offers from large firms, but decided to open her own firm, focused on helping ordinary people against giant corporations. She once told me, "You taught me that justice isn't just about winning in court. It's about changing lives." It was a sincere tribute, and I knew that our work together had left a deep mark on her as well. We remain close, and whenever we meet for coffee, we laugh about the memories of that insane battle. She still jokes that I'm the most complicated client she's ever had, but I know she's proud of everything we've accomplished. As for the other women who testified against David, the victory brought relief and healing. Claire, who almost gave up out of fear of threats, was able to rebuild her life. With the support of the foundation I created, she started working as an independent consultant and now helps others confront abuse in the workplace. Mia, who stood by me from the beginning, found strength she didn't even know she had. Today, she is a vocal advocate for women's rights in the corporate world, using her story to inspire others to fight against injustice. Seeing how these women have grown and become stronger has been one of the greatest rewards of this journey. As for me, well, my life has changed completely. The financial compensation was beyond what I could have dreamed of, but the real impact was emotional and psychological. I moved to the Gold Coast, where I built a new routine away from the chaos of Melbourne. I bought that beachfront house I had always admired and began to devote my time to activities that really mattered to me. I started writing about my experiences, sharing them with the world through lectures and articles. My foundation grew quickly, and soon we had a whole team helping victims of corporate abuse regain their dignity. Every story I hear reminds me of the importance of continuing this fight. But perhaps the biggest change has been within me. The Laura who walked into that courtroom for the first time, trembling and full of doubt, no longer exists. In her place is a woman who knows the value of her voice and the power of her resilience. I have learned that the scars left by battles can be transformed into strength, and that even when all seems lost, there is always a chance to turn the tide. Today, I look back and see how each character in this story was shaped by the events. David lost everything, but his downfall exposed a rotten system that needed to be dismantled. Sarah found a new purpose, and the women who stood by me rediscovered their strength. As for me, I found peace and a sense of mission that goes far beyond myself. This battle wasn't just about winning. It was about turning pain into purpose. This journey has taught me something profound about the nature of struggle and justice. At first, it all seemed so personal, an injustice committed against me by a man who thought he was above the rules. But as events unfolded, I realized that this story wasn't just about me or David. It was about something much bigger. The power of the individual in the face of oppressive systems, the importance of speaking up even when it seems impossible, and the impact that one person can have by choosing to fight. When I started this battle, I just wanted to regain my dignity. I wanted David to understand that he couldn't treat me like I was disposable. But over time, I realized that this fight was symbolic of something universal: the human desire to be seen, heard, and respected. The truth is that many people face injustice every day, at work, at home, in society, and often remain silent because they are afraid of the consequences. I myself have had that fear. There were times when I thought about giving up, accepting the weight of defeat and moving on, but something inside me knew that wasn't enough. If I bowed my head, I would be allowing him to continue doing this to other people, and that I couldn't accept. The central theme of this story goes beyond revenge or personal victory. It's about courage. The courage to face our own fears, to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations for the greater good, to believe that we are capable of changing things, even when the world tells us otherwise. I learned that justice isn't something that just happens. It's something we have to build, step by step, decision by decision. It requires sacrifice, patience, and above all, faith in ourselves. I also realized that the system, as flawed as it is, still has room for change. The fact that we were able to expose David and his corrupt practices showed that even in a world full of inequality, there are ways to fight against the abuse of power. Of course, it wasn't easy. We had to give up comfort, security, and even peace of mind to achieve this result. But in the end, it was worth it. Because when you face something bigger than yourself, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're opening doors for other people too. Another important point I reflected on is the concept of revenge. At first, I admit that part of me wanted David to suffer for the things he did. But over time, I realized that true satisfaction didn't come from seeing him lose everything. It came from knowing that I had grown up, that I had overcome the fear he tried to instill in me. The best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's becoming someone they never imagined you could be. Today, I look back and see that David, without knowing it, gave me a gift. The opportunity to discover my inner strength and use my voice to make a difference. This story is also about human connections. I couldn't have done it alone. Sarah was my anchor. Mia and Claire were my comrades in arms, and even the people who gave up along the way taught me something valuable about the weight of choices and the fear that often paralyzes us. Every interaction, every obstacle has shaped who I am today. This journey has shown me that no one fights alone. We all need each other to move forward. Ultimately, this experience has made me understand that life is made up of cycles. We suffer, we learn, we grow, and if we are lucky, we find ways to turn our pain into purpose. My foundation, my speaking engagements, my new life on the Gold Coast. All of this was born out of something that initially felt like the end, but in reality, it was just a new beginning. The ultimate lesson I carry with me is this: never underestimate the power of a determined person. One voice may seem small, but when it echoes in the right places, it can bring down empires.